All right, folks, let's get underway. Welcome. Thank you very much for coming. As always, I want to thank the three organizations that co-sponsor these evenings. The Left Forum, that I know brings some of you here. Democracy at Work, which brings others of you here. And finally, the Judson Memorial Church, which contributes this space and its support for what we do here. I also wanted to mention that, as I think some of you know, because you've mentioned it to me, that these talks that I do here, and that, as I think you know, we post right away on the websites that we maintain, and that there they get picked up and sent all over the world, which we know because we get emails literally from all over the world about these monthly talks, are now beginning to generate a broader interest. It's sort of interesting to watch. And one of the signs and culminations of that was an invitation 2 weeks ago, since our last gathering here, from Bill Maher, for me to go out to Los Angeles, which I did 10 days ago, in order to be the opening interview of his program on the 25th of July, which is a Friday. He does his show live in the Beverly Hills Hollywood studios out there at 7 o'clock on a Friday night, so it's 10 o'clock here. But he only does it live, so in order for me to participate, they had to sweep me out to Los Angeles that Friday morning, bring me back to New York the next day on Saturday. It's a bit of a whirlwind, to say the least. It was a remarkable experience and a little humbling, to say the least, that millions of people were able to have a chance to witness a conversation. And there were many things you could say about the conversation, and we don't have the time. But I thought at least one idea has come to me from a lot of emails I got as a result, which is that there was something symbolic about change in the United States, that on a mass audience program like that, the host would have a conversation of a perfectly normal and reasonable way with someone identified as a Marxist about Marxism, and that there were no horns on anybody's head, at least as far as anyone could notice, and that the whole thing came off in a perfectly reasonable way, and that even a couple of times, for those of you that saw it, what the Marxist had to say engendered applause. About 300 people, it's a live audience, about 300 people in the auditorium that's right behind the cameras there, and that was not lost on anybody, including Bill Maher. So, remarkable kind of experience. I'm absolutely flattered and honored that he saw fit to do this. And I would say for folks like you that there's something worth pondering, that he had the courage and the idea that this is a reasonable thing to do, and so he did it. And as far as I can tell from what they told me, they're pleased with the outcome, I'm pleased with the outcome, and it says something about what we're doing here and what it might be meaning to people across the United States that's changing what the country was. Okay, so let's turn then to what we're going to do tonight. And again, as you know, what I like to do is structure. We do a few kind of short things that are happening in the world of economics over the last month since we last met, and then we go into some bigger topics. And I pick these short things not so much for the specifics of each story, although these are specific stories, but because of what I think they suggest. So let me start with a report. This appeared in the Washington Post on the 29th of July, so a week ago, about developments in the school system of Detroit. Now, you all know that Detroit is a very seriously collapsed American economic situation. It's a city that's formally in bankruptcy, which is an extreme step not that many cities in America have taken, ever. And Detroit is the largest city to have to declare bankruptcy in the history of the United States. So it's a fairly important thing. And they're supposed to come up with ways to deal with the economic collapse. Before I tell you what they've come up with, I want to make sure we all understand what this collapse is. It has nothing to do with pensions of public employees. It has nothing to do with any peculiar quality of the people of Detroit. It really is very simple. Often these things are not simple, but this one is. Detroit is the motor city. That's because it's the home, or it was the home, of the American automobile industry. The place where General Motors, Ford, and Chrysler had their headquarters, had their growth, and made that city world famous. A successful city in many ways, a large city, a city in which a well-entrenched middle class of workers developed. Not only white ones, but African Americans in sizable numbers, which made it even more interesting as an example of what American capitalism once was able to do. Then a decision was made by three companies, Ford, General Motors, and Chrysler. And the decision was, after years of struggle, with a union that was once the most important and powerful union in America, the United Auto Workers, the UAW, in which the United Auto Workers pioneered many of the advances that other workers were able to get, wages, benefits, all kinds of things. Names like Walter Reuther and others, for those of you who know your labor history, were paradigmatic for the American labor movement because of what was achieved in that place. And those companies, having been forced to provide decent wages and benefits, for which, by the way, they often took credit, that they had created an American middle class, as if the company had done this out of its good heart and largesse, which required you to know nothing about history, since the workers had to fight for everything that those companies ever gave them, and they are famous, the struggles. The sit-down, the tactic used in the civil rights movement, where people sit down, you know, they have a sit-down strike, or they sit in, that was pioneered by the workers who sat in the auto factories. Most famously in Flint, Michigan, a suburb where this was done by the UAW and was a major part of American labor history. Anyway, the companies discovered in the 1970s that there was a way around the good wages they had been forced to pay. And that way was to leave Detroit and move production to places where there was no union, to places where they wouldn't have to observe all kinds of other rules and regulations, could get away with paying much lower taxes as well as lower wages. And the companies decided that for the interest of boosting their profits, they would leave Detroit. First, they left for other parts of the United States, mostly in the American South. Then they went to Canada and Mexico, and now basically they're gone worldwide with particular interest in India and China. End result, again, for those of you who don't know the story, is the decimation of Detroit. As I've told you earlier, from a little under 2 million people in the 1960s, the population of Detroit today is 700,000. The majority of the people of Detroit were basically abandoned. There were no jobs for them, and as a result, the people of Detroit did what any people do if there's no work. They left Detroit. There was no place for them. Leaving Detroit a kind of disaster zone. If you ever have the opportunity by your travels to visit Detroit, do it. It'll be one of the most unforgettable lessons in American history you'll ever have. Much more powerful than reading a book or having a lecture. Just travel, drive through that city and watch as the block after block of abandoned houses, half of which have burnt down, greet you. So we know what happened to Detroit. The car companies that built it up abandoned it. And when they abandoned it, there were no requirements. The way law works in the United States, a company that picks up and leaves is free to do so. Now, over the decades, the city of Detroit, the state of Michigan, and the federal government have given all kinds of publicly funded benefits to those car companies. They have developed training programs for young people in schools so that they would have the skills that the companies wanted them to have. They built roads where it would be convenient for the parts to come in and the cars to be sent out. They moved the rail passage to facilitate that. They provided subsidies. Perhaps the biggest one was back in 2008, not that long ago, when General Motors and Chrysler basically declared bankruptcy, and the United States government came in and gave them, in the case of General Motors alone, $50 billion in subsidy. So the federal, the state, and the local government have given and given and given. But when they decided to make more money, they left. And they left with no responsibility for the disaster that their leaving caused. So now the city can't function. It doesn't have enough people. It can't get any revenue because the people are gone, and those that are left are in serious trouble. You can't raise taxes. They refuse to raise taxes on the rich. They refuse to raise taxes on business. That's a taboo in our society these days for politicians. So they declared bankruptcy, which is what you do when you have more obligations than you have resources. And they declared bankruptcy. They're in bankruptcy now. And so they're supposed to come up with ways of solving their problems. And what I'm about to tell you is the way that got publicized this last week, and as I say, from the Washington Post on the 29th of July. A bunch of the schools in East Detroit, that's not a separate city, that's part of Detroit, have come up with a new plan. Some of you can see the headline from this story. Kindergartens will have 100 students. I couldn't make this up because it's so far beyond anything that a person who isn't a ghoul could come up with that it doesn't occur to me. Not only do we have 100, but when the press began to press about this, isn't this a kind of awful thing to do, making the situation worse, not better, by denying young kids the chance to have a relationship with a teacher at an age when you need that very badly to get your education going, and everybody knows that? I learned further in this story that there are 3 teachers for these 100. The lead teacher is 30 years old. The second teacher is in her 2nd year of teaching, and the third teacher is in her 1st year of teaching. In other words, we've put 100 kids in a kindergarten with 3 inexperienced teachers. That's the way that Detroit and the political leadership are dealing with the collapse of the society. There's no way other than to say they're responding to the collapse of their society by finding ways to make the collapse worse. That's a sign of a society that is spinning out of control, because everybody knows small classes are better than big classes. You don't need to have an advanced education. This is not the famous rocket science. If you want to do something to offset the deterioration of life for the people of Detroit, this is the last thing on earth you would think to do. But here in America, in 2014, that's what Detroit is experimenting with. Second piece of news I wanted to bring to you has to do with Texas. In Texas, they have an enormous foster care system. And they have that because, there are many reasons of course, but basically an awful lot of people who, I don't know how to say this politely, get pregnant and can't or don't want to deal with that situation, or want to but are prevented by the state from doing that, end up with children that they can't take care of or don't want to take care of, and pass them into the foster care system. since the state can't do anything because of its politics about the issues leading up to these abandoned kids, they have to take care of them. But they don't want to spend the money because Texas is very proud of keeping its taxes low. So they don't have the money. And what system did they come up with? They privatized the foster care system. In other words, they farmed it out to private companies who would do this. And the biggest of these, the Providence Service Corporation. You know, when you get names like that, words strung together that have absolutely no meaning, that something smelly is going on behind there, and that these are cover terms. There are some exceptions to this rule, but not many. The Providence Service Corporation got a wonderful contract. 5-year contract worth $30 million a year. Nice. After 18 months, they quit. And they explained, these are Texans, they explained they weren't making enough profit. So they're out of this business. They dumped these kids and the whole apparatus back into the state of Texas. So I began to look into what's going on here. Texas has a rule. The contracts signed by the state of Texas with these private companies specify that the private organization cannot spend more than the state did to perform the same services. So the money that the state was spending when the private company tried to do the job with that amount of money, the private company discovered real quickly as not doable. It's nowhere near enough money to do what had to be done simply to meet the minimum requirements of the state for this service. So the private companies are dumping it back into the state, which of course is proceeding as if it had not just been told that the amount of money being provided for foster children cannot do the job. The next time you hear some politician tell you about how we're cutting the fat out of the budget, remember the foster kids in Texas. That's what that means. That's what that ends up doing. Foster children. People who you might want to think, deserve a break are not getting a break. They're getting treated abysmally. Third thing, short. This week, President Obama welcomed many of the leaders of Africa. This is an event that does not happen very often. Africa is kind of a place which in world politics is an afterthought most of the time. It is in many ways the poorest continent in the world right now. And so Obama brought together a bunch of African leaders on the one hand and the heads of a huge number of American major corporations on the other. The point being to increase the chances that these corporations will invest in Africa, in these African countries, which the governments of Africa dearly want because their situation is grim. And out of this came an enormous amount of public relations, as some of you must have seen it in the newspaper recently, about the booming African possibility. So I have a sad job to tell you. The first book I ever wrote, I wrote a lot of books because in the United States, if you have to be a professor and you want to be successful, you have to write a lot of books. It's not all that important what you write. It doesn't matter really what the quality is. It's really how many. And, well, no, seriously, and when you come up for tenure, if that's what you do, many professors used to have tenure. We're getting rid of that silliness in America now. Silliness, that's an attempt on my part at being humorous. But I had to write a lot of books, and the first book I ever wrote was a book about Kenya, an African country where I wrote an economic history of what it meant to that society to be a colony of Great Britain, which is what Kenya was before it became independent in the 1950s and 60s. Anyway, so I follow African events ever since I wrote that book. Life expectancy in Africa today is 58 years. In this country, it's 20 years more than that. That is a sign of unbelievable health difficulty. Bad food, bad health care, bad. It's a disaster. 77% of school-age children go to school. A quarter of the school-age children don't go to school at all. In many African countries, in order to go to school, you have to pay school fees. It's not a system of free public education, partly because the societies are poor, and so the quarter of the kids who get no education at all and are therefore left with the life that they can have with that deficit, these are signs, and I could go on and on. The honest thing to say is that Africa has been neglected, and Africa has been used for its raw materials for a long time, and that the rest of the world has benefited by basically taking this stuff away from them and also bringing large numbers of their people, most of them involuntarily, out of the country, as you know, because it's part of our history, and that the world, in some sense, could pay back a little of what it took and make a difference in these conditions, which would be a bigger contribution to economic development than having a few big corporations come in there and probably do what big corporations have done in Africa for 100 years anyway. None of that is discussed. Instead, we have photo opportunities of President Obama and the heads of these companies and the heads of those governments meeting and celebrating the enormous potential of Africa. When I did my research about the end of the 19th century, there were also meetings in Berlin and Paris and London, more than in the United States, which celebrated the enormous potential of Africa. It really is a mind-warping rehash of something that's 100 years old and has never worked to bring Africa out of the conditions that it is in. Okay, last shorter item, and I'm adjusting a little bit what we're going to be able to do this evening. It has to do with this perennial issue of inequality. When I went to California to be on the Bill Maher television program, one of the topics that I discussed with the executive producers there, which they proposed, was inequality in the United States. And if, for those of you who saw the program, that's actually how Bill Maher began the conversation. He referred to an article that appeared on the 4th of July. The symbolism here should not be lost on all of you. On the 4th of July, USA Today, which is our only really national newspaper in this country, USA Today, which tells you a lot about the United States anyway, right there, but put that aside. USA Today, on the 4th of July, carried a very interesting story. And the story said that they, the USA Today staff, had done a study of what it would cost for an American family of 4 to have the American dream. And they work it out in the article. You can see what they mean by that, that you have a house of a certain size, you have a car, you either are paying for your kids' education or saving up to be able to do it. You spend so much on food and you spend so much on insurance. And they worked it out, and they took lots of reputable sources to get estimates, and they figured out that today in the United States, it would take for a modest, they have a modest version, that's their word, a modest version of the American dream would cost a family of 4 $130,000 of income per year. A more generous one would cost $150,000. By the way, if any of you interested, go on the internet and you can go find the July 4th issue of USA Today and you can see the specifics. And then the article makes the point, quietly, without much fanfare, that if you look at America, the distribution of income in America, 1 out of 8 families earns $130,000 or more. 7/8 of the American households are no longer capable of enjoying the American dream, even that modest version. They're not getting it, they have no prospects of getting it, and their children even less. And this is This upset Bill Maher. And that's one of the reasons he had told his staff, that's one of the things they wanted to have me there to talk about. That this says something fairly profound about the United States, and the USA Today put it there on the 4th of July as the day they chose to print that article. So I wanted to talk a little bit about it, and I've had some help from Peter Marcuse, who kindly sent me something that he had written about it as well. So I wanted to add a little bit. First, the Russell Sage Foundation, some of you know that group, a very interesting group. They do very good research. And one of the interesting things they did is they wanted to ask not about the income, but about the wealth. How much property do Americans have? And how has that changed? Because it's different to look at your income, what flows into you from the work you do, and then to look at how much property you have. Now, most Americans, in case you're not familiar with it, have little or no property. Some of you know that from intense, intimate, personal experience, no doubt. And if you're an American and you have some property, it's overwhelmingly likely that that property is your home. In other words, the number of Americans who either have no property or have no property other than their home tells the story. Only the richest of us have property that includes the home and other things. The other things being stocks and bonds and all of that kind of thing. So most Americans have no property. If you have property, it's your home. And there's a statistic that economists use called your net worth. And that basically is a simple idea. They add up the property you own and they subtract the debts you have to get your net worth. What you own less the part that you don't really own because you owe it to somebody else. And this is the Russell Sage, and it's reported in the New York Times of July 26. That's where I'm getting these numbers. In 2003, the adjusted net worth, typical household, $87,900. Taking everything together, your property, includes your car and your home and whatever you have, $87,000. 10 years later, 2013, $56,000, a drop of 36%. Now, folks, whatever happens to your income, that's not the only thing that shapes your economic activity or your behavior or your sense of your own safety. You are also, whether you're conscious of it or not, you're also concerned about how much wealth you have. So, for example, if your income dries up, it's your wealth you have to fall back on. So if your wealth is shrinking, this could be a very disturbing and troubling and anxiety-provoking experience. What the numbers indicate is that while income is hard enough for Americans, while their income was shrinking, their wealth was falling. And there's no mystery about it. That's about housing. The value of houses in the United States has not recovered from the downturn it took in 2007 and 2008. And therefore the wealth Americans have, since most Americans, the only wealth they have is their home, that's depressed. And so Americans are worried. One of the reasons Americans aren't buying goods and services, why there are so many stores in New York that are empty and sitting there empty for months at a time, is because people don't have the wherewithal to buy. And even if they have the money that they're earning, looking at what's happening to their wealth, they don't want to spend because they're scared, which is the rational response to this situation. All the statistics, all of them, even those dredged up by the most conservative economists, admit the growing inequality of wealth in the United States, the growing inequality of income, which worsens the inequality of wealth. The statistics here are dramatic. For example, 1983, this is from Peter Marcuse, 1983, the net worth of the top 1% was 34%. That is, the richest 1% owned 34% of all the wealth. Right? 2010, it had gone up to 35.5%. It's staggering. The rich have become richer and everybody else is in trouble. And my guess is most of you fall in the everybody else category. And part of the reason I say this so often as I travel around the country speaking is it's really important for Americans to understand that the economic anxieties they feel and the economic difficulties they have are not about them as individuals. And don't kill yourself by drinking because of it or taking other substances I won't go into detail about, but you all know about, or blaming yourself, or agonizing over what you didn't do when you were a student, what courses you didn't take, or what majors you didn't choose, or any of those. This is not about that. This is a social problem, and it's an economic problem, and you're just being victimized by it. And the worst thing to do if you're victimized by a social problem is to convert it into an individual problem, because that leads you to the idea that you can individually solve a social problem. This is the same kind of task to give yourself as if you said to yourself, I am now going to fly over the Empire State Building. No matter how many steps back you take and how much of a running start you get and how many times you practice, you probably know that your attempt to fly over the Empire State Building is going to result in grief, chiefly for you. Trying to solve the economic problem that I'm describing, that is engulfing this society and others, as if you're the one who caused it and you're the one who can fix it, is painful to watch. It's not going to work. It's going to make you feel terrible. And meanwhile, you're not helping to build the social movement, which is the only way you solve a social problem. Okay. I don't want to leave on a negative note, which some of you have pointed out. So let me end these short comments by bringing to your attention, if you have not already heard about them, 2 out of several, there are more, but 2 out of several examples where Americans in the last month have done something very interesting in the way of collectively trying to deal with these situations. And one of them comes from Seattle on the West Coast, and one of them from Massachusetts, New Hampshire, and Maine on the East Coast. So how nice. We can talk about it. Seattle. In Seattle, there is a family. The man is a veteran, U.S. military veteran, wounded, and who has to work in a, live and function in a wheelchair because he was hurt, a U.S. veteran. He and his wife have been battling with the banks over the mortgage problems they have, and they're in the courts trying to work that out. But through a technicality in the law, the bank that holds the mortgage was able to get a judgment, even though they're not finished haggling over all of it, that enabled the bank to call the sheriff. You get a judgment against someone in a house and you've lent the money to the people in the house, you then, that's American law, you can call the sheriff, show the sheriff this legal judgment, and the sheriff is then required to go to the home, give a notice of 24 hours or 36 hours, and then if you haven't left the home because you have this judgment, they put you out. They literally take you, carry you, and your furniture and your clothing and everything else, and put it out, by the way, on the street in front of your home. And they tell you, when they're done, the sheriff does all this with the sheriff's deputies, you know, like the old cowboy movies, except they don't use horses anymore. The sheriff then tells you, okay, we've now put all your stuff on the curb because you're evicted from your home, but we now have to tell you that you can't leave your stuff on the curb for more than 12 hours because that's illegal. And therefore, if you haven't gotten this stuff out of here by, you know, tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock, a truck will come and take it and dump it someplace, and you may never see it again. So this is, to put it mildly, bad news for the family in question, and it was really bad news for this a wounded veteran in a wheelchair and his wife. They were both, I believe, in their 70s or late 60s or 70s, old people. So far, this story is painful and repeated 1,000 times everywhere in America, and it's been going on for years. But I wouldn't be telling you if it was just another story like this, because something interesting happened. Two groups in Seattle. One just formed out of a kind of outrage that this nice old couple who were hurting nobody and who were still having a legal case that they were fighting would be treated this way. And the other one was the group that put into power Kshama Sawant, this unusual socialist candidate who won a place on the city council in Seattle in the last election, last November. And some of you have followed her career since then. Remarkable that a woman with dark skin in Seattle defeated a longtime incumbent Democrat to get that seat. Many, many thousands of people voted for her, and she called herself a socialist. Again, suggesting things are shifting here in the US of A. And her people, together with this ad hoc group, did something very interesting. They went to the house, and they got there at the time the sheriff was already doing his thing and was going to take them, the couple, someplace in his car as his deputies were. And they sat all around the police car, and they sat all around the property, and they said they weren't going to move. So that if the sheriff was going to carry out his orders, he'd have to drive into or over the people sitting there. Old and young, men and women, a lot of people. This precipitated an anxiety on the part of the sheriff, who wasn't prepared for this sort of thing. So the sheriff called the mayor. And the mayor came down, looked at the situation, talked to everybody, and then the mayor told the sheriff to go home. And the people went back in the house, and it's going to be decided by the court. Now, this is a little moment, but it's a different little moment than we're used to. Something happened here. And when the press came and realized what was going on, they asked the mayor. And the mayor's answer was also interesting. I'm sure that in our city of Seattle, it's a big city, I'm sure that the police and the sheriff's office have many other things they need to attend to that are more important than moving people out of their homes. Let's have them do that while the courts decide. Something's happening. Something is moving people to do things they didn't do before. Second story. East. In Massachusetts, New Hampshire, and Maine, there is a small chain of supermarkets. They are called the Market Basket Stores. Those of you who ever travel up there may know of them or have heard of them. This is a family business, even though it's got, I believe, about 70 stores. It's a big supermarket chain. A Greek family, Demoulas by name, owns it and has owned it for 2 or 3 generations. It's grown over time. And there's lots of struggles in this family, and they're the board of directors, this family. And so, you know, you can imagine, all of you, knowing the kinds of conflicts you're familiar with in your own family, what a mess that is there. And imagine that now writ large, because you all run a big enterprise. Can you imagine where the little difficulties can become big ones about millions of dollars and so forth? So they have this terrible struggle inside the family. Okay? But it gets now interesting. There are 2 brothers who are struggling to control this company. And which one controls it depends on how many members of the family support brother 1 versus how many members of the family support brother 2. It gets more complicated because both of them are named Arthur Demoulas. One is Arthur S. Demoulas, and the other one is Arthur T. Demoulas. Okay? I just want you to get the full romance of all of this. Now it gets more interesting. one of the authors, who was in charge, has a vision for how to run a store. And this chain of stores he ran as follows. There's a very generous profit-sharing program. In other words, when the company does well, a sizable chunk of the profits are distributed to all the workers under the following remarkable thought, that when a company that employs, as they do, 600 or 700 people, when a company makes a lot of profits, it's probably because the workers together, all in their way, contributed to that profit, and that therefore, revolutionary idea, you might want to reward the people who helped to do it with some of what they helped to do. It's not that complicated. And this Arthur Demoulas reasoned that way, and so he had a generous program. The other Arthur, having paid more attention in the business school to what they taught him, said, we get the profit. They're the workers. They're paid off with their wages, end of story for them. They get their wages, they go home. And he had the idea to sell the company to a bigger supermarket chain that could absorb it, and to take a big chunk of the profits that they had amassed and distribute them to the shareholders, who turn out to be the family, because it's a privately held company. Now the workers, 750 of them, got scared because they could see that which way it went in the family, and by the way, the votes were all split, and one ant would wobble. And if she wobbled this way, Arthur S. won, and if she wobbled out, and she wobbled, depending on who spoke to her last, gave her a nicer birthday present or whatever it was. And so it was very touch and go, but the workers got scared because they could see if it went one way, not only would they lose their profit share because the profits would be given to the family, but the company would be sold, and when they sold the company, they might eliminate a lot of jobs, which is often how these things work, and then where would they be? Where with the other guy, he was into profit sharing, and he didn't want to sell the company. So the workers clearly favored Arthur, if I remember it, T over Arthur S, but it doesn't matter because the point of the story is the workers then began to act like the people in Seattle. And they began to picket the stores and to picket the warehouses where things were kept before they were shipped to the different stores. And they began to demand that the one Arthur run the company, not the other Arthur. In other words, they inserted themselves into the decision-making apparatus of the corporation. The no-no of American economic structure, they violated. And they were clever. They went to the local towns in Massachusetts where these stores are concentrated, and they approached the politicians, the Democrats and Republicans, and they said, we want you out on the street with us. We want you picketing with us. This company is doing things that are going to be bad for us, and therefore bad for the community, and therefore bad for the political unit that you represent. You should be with us. And the local politicians, seeing how many voters and families were involved here, 700 workers, joined them on the picket line, particularly in Tewksbury. Some of you know Massachusetts, where a lot of this happened. This is all over the last 2 or 3 weeks, so this is very new. And so it struck me that there are two really interesting things here. First, the idea is not in the minds of these people, we're going to change American capitalism, we're going to give the workers a say over what is done with the profits they help to... None of that. I say that sort of thing. They didn't. But they're doing it. They're doing it. They're in saying, we demand a say in who runs this company because we prefer one to the other. The second thing I found stunning about that is its historical repetition. In many countries that eventually had revolutions, in the years before the revolution, the people would rise up and favor King 1 over King 2. They would want, for example, this happened in Spain just recently, they would want the king to abdicate and give it over to his son. And the people would say, we want the king or we want the son. It's very similar, you know. We can see that one ruler is a hell of a lot better for us than the other one. And it's the beginning of people beginning to move when they not only think it, but they get together with other people and act on it. And in history, that has usually been an opening step that a few steps later came to the realization, what the hell are we doing preferring one king to another, one corporate president to another? If we ran the show, we wouldn't be in this pickle in the first place. There ought to be no kings at all, which is why we don't have them anymore. They either went quietly or they got separated from their heads. The kings. The people are now moving in America and saying, I prefer this corporate president to that one. My suspicion is that we will also learn, hopefully it won't take too long, that it oughtn't to be corporate presidents who make these decisions. Since everybody has to live with the results of the decision, it ought to be made by all the people who have to live with it. It's the basic idea of democracy. And in their own way, the American working class in Seattle in one way and in New England in another is groping its way to this understanding, and there are now concrete examples of it, and I think it's worth thinking about. Okay, let me turn then to some of the bigger issues that have come up over the last month, and as you know, some of these issues are much older than the last month, but they became urgent in the last month. The first one I want to talk to you about is markets. A good number of you have either written to me or spoken to me about it, so I want to talk to you about markets. What is a market? Well, the first thing, many of the public statements by our political leaders and our corporate leaders refer to us as having a market economy or a free market economy. So if that's what we are, we ought to talk about this and make sure we all kind of get what that means. And then there are others, many of them, who not only say we are a market economy, but go on and become absolutely poetic about the marvels of market economies, that these really are the ultimate achievement of the human intellect, something to be nurtured, preserved, celebrated, and given the absolute adulation of all of us. And I would like to take them down a peg, or maybe 10. So let me try to do that. First, what is a market? A market is not a complex event. A market is a system of distributing things. That's all it is. Distributing resources like land and the things we find in the ground and water and resources. And it's a system of distributing the products, the things we produce in factories, offices, and stores. Now, a market, that's all markets are. They're ways of distributing things. And here's how it works, just real simple. I make a pad. So I produce a pad. However it's done, I do that. Now, I'm a producer of pads, and I'm very proud of the pads I produce, but I noticed something, being very smart, that I can't eat this pad. Or it doesn't taste good and will not nourish me real well, and I'm going to get sick, and then I'm going to die, and then I won't be able to produce pads anymore. So I have a problem. I produce pads, damn good ones, but I have to acquire some other way food so I can eat, clothes that I can wear, all the other things of life. So in a market system, the way I acquire the things I need that I don't myself produce, because I produce pads, is I engage, here we go now, in a distribution system. I distribute my pad to a whole variety of people in exchange, keyword exchange, for them giving me the products they produce. Bread from the baker, shirts from the clothing maker, etc., etc. So I distribute how? In a quid pro quo. I'll give you 3 of these, you give me 4 of those. Or if there's a money system, I'll give you this for $3, and then I'll use my $3 to buy a bunch of carrots. I can eat the carrots, I can't eat this, and meanwhile, you can keep track of the carrots you're growing by using my pad. So you get my pad, I get your carrots, and we have distributed, see that? We have moved stuff from the producer to the consumer by means of a quid pro quo exchange. I'll give you some of this. That's what a market is. That's what a market is. It's a way of distributing things. Second, through most of the history of the human race, markets were not the way people distributed things, neither resources nor products. For example, in the societies we nowadays like to call primitive, they didn't do that. You go check, do your anthropology, you'll see, they didn't do that. Here's what they did. Everybody produced whatever it is they produced. The baker made the bread, and the chicken farmer raised the chickens and the eggs. And then, at a certain time, when the chickens were done and the grain was grown, and they got together at a place, and they had someone they had confidence in distribute it. Could be the king, could be the head man, could be the priestess, could be the council of elders, could be the religious leader. Societies had lots of ways of doing that. And these people distributed the products according to what they thought in those communities was a reasonable way to do that. Do you understand? There was no bargain. The baker didn't say, I'll give you 2 loaves, give me that pad. It didn't go like that. All the loaves were put on a table, and the elders or whoever was given that power distributed them. It's very important you understand. That was the way most of human history works. And again, to drive it home, that's how most of us work inside our families. Thanksgiving dinner. Mama makes the turkey. You're all gathered at the table. She cuts off the drumstick. Does she reach it out on the table and say, one on my bid? Well, that would be a market. If she distributed the cooked, no, it's serious. If she distributed the cooked turkey leg by getting a quid pro quo, you offer to give 2 sets of earrings for that, then that would be a... But she wouldn't do that. And nobody in the family would think of it. And if one of you said, I want the turkey leg, I offer not 2 earrings, 3. And your sister said, I offer 4. At some point, your father or your grandmother would intervene and say, this is disgusting. And they would give you a little speech, wouldn't they? This is a family. You know, we do things for one another, this is important, because we love each other. I'm the mother, I make the turkey, I enjoy that. I enjoy that you enjoy eating it. I have a sense of satisfaction, a sense of being a nurturer. It means something to me. And I know you get a pleasure by having your mother cook for you because it has all this complex psychological. And so I'm not going to distribute it by a bargaining session. That's outrageous. That contradicts the way we want to distribute things amongst us in this family, which is out of caring for one another and loving one another. Wow. This is a way of saying, if you want to have love relationships, don't have markets. What a dangerous idea. Because if that's true in the family, here's a thought. It might be true outside the family too. What does it mean that in order to go to a hospital in most parts of the United States and get treated for an injury, the first question they ask you when you come in is, where's your insurance card? That's a none too subtle way of saying, you want to be cured? Pay. I will give you 20 minutes of a doctor. You got to give me, and if you can't, you don't get. That's what a market is. You ought to think about whether a market is the way you want to distribute. What is this celebration of markets? Let me give you another example. As I told you, I flew to Los Angeles 10 days ago to do that program. And I noticed something on the airplane. Because I was the guest, I was given a first-class ticket. And United Airlines, I don't mind mentioning, why not? And United Airlines, on the airplane that I had 16 seats in the front, first-class seats. And then steerage, or whatever they call it, in the back. You know, those places where you are like a sardine in the can. My seats were charming. I had a lot of room. I could press a button. You may all know this. I was not familiar. I pressed a button, and the seat flattens out into a bed. So I can lie down. And as I pressed the button, the staff, by the way, the 16 of us in the front had exactly as many servers as the 200 in the back. We had as many toilets as they did, which is why you never had to wait online. The steerage people blew up, I guess, waiting online, okay? So I thought about this in preparation for tonight. And here's what came to me. There are two kinds of seats on these planes. Horrible ones and lovely ones. 16 lovely ones and lots of horrible ones. And there are 200 and however many people there were on the plane as a whole. And so there is an issue here, isn't there? And the issue is who is going to get the 16 seats? That's a distribution question. There's 16 places and we have to distribute them. We can't give 16 places to 200 people. If there were 6 people on each seat, this is not comfortable. We don't have that. We rule that out. So here's the question. Who gets the 16 seats? The nice ones, the pleasant ones. That's a distribution question. Now, here's the way we could do it. We could say, let's see, older people should go on the nice seats. Because why? Because they're older. Their bones hurt. They ought to be able to lie down. They might need to rest more than the rest of us. You know, all the reasons that you might want to say, gee, they're old people. Here's the second one. Maybe it should go to people who are not feeling so good. Ill, maybe. Or with an injury or something like that. That, you know, kind of, you know. I don't need to tell you this. Here's another one. Maybe those seats should go to a person who's never flown in an airplane before, to give him or her a real experience of the sort that would make them remember. That would be a charming thing to do. Right? Let's keep records of who's been on airplanes, and if you can show you're on the list, you've never done this before, you're going to go up there, and you're going to see what this experience could be nice. Here's another one. Some people are, just a few, overweight. And sticking an overweight person in that sardine seat in the back is a peculiar kind of cruelty. Let's not do that. And if there are people who are overweight, let's let them sit there because they need it more than the rest of us do. You could do that. Here's another one. You could say, we have veterans amongst us, people who have given their all, or obviously if they're given their all, they wouldn't be there, but nearly their all. Part of their all they have given, and so in recognition that we appreciate this, if that's how we feel, they get a chance to get the seat. Here's another system. We could have rotation. Here's an idea. Everybody should have a chance to enjoy this remarkable experience, so we'll keep records, and we'll check, and the computer makes this easy. Have you ever been in first class before? If you have, well, you kind of go to the end of the line. And if you haven't, well, you're in the group. Then we then select randomly. And over time, sooner or later you're going to get your shot at being in the lovely seat. That would be an interesting thing. We could do it by lottery, with or without rotation. Make it like buying a ticket. You get it or you don't. Okay? We could even develop point system where all of these things would count. You'd get so many points if you're above 60. You'd get so many points if you've had a major illness. We could work out all kinds of systems that would allocate this set of seats, that is, distribute them under a set of rules that we would all find interesting and useful. We could even vote democratically as to which rules would apply. That way we would have a system that we all voted on. We had our say and the majority ruled. We don't do that. Instead, we allocate the seats by one rule, the market. And the seats go to the people who got the money. You don't got the money, you don't get the seat. You got the money, you get the seat. We don't care whether you made the money by hard work, whether you stole every nickel, whether you killed people to acquire it, whether you ripped off whole societies to... We don't care. We use the market. Now, let me be blunt with you. To believe that the market is a superior way to allocate resources and products is buffoonery. It's a kind of fundamentalism that outdoes even religious fundamentalism. The market is the best thing we... What? That's an insult to all of us. I just gave you 10 examples of alternative ways of distributing these things that at least are worth a conversation. We should shut up and say, market is the best. It isn't. Never was. You know who loves the market? The people with the money. And why is that? Because they get the winnings in a market system. That's all. And if you let them confuse you by suggesting, no, it's not that we like the markets because we have all the money. It's we like the markets because it's the most efficient. Stop. You're being hustled. That's the same person who's going to sell you a majority interest in the Brooklyn Bridge. You giggle, but you ought to giggle over the other one too. Now, some of you might say, because if you have conservative leanings in your family and they've infected you, you might say, well, you know, the airline company gets a lot of money for those lovely seats, and that's how they earn their money. And if you let people who are old or sick or had never done it before sit there who couldn't pay extra, gee, well, okay, let's examine that. One, if we let people sit in the front who paid the regular fare, that would mean that the profits of the airline companies would go down. Big deal. Why are we, who never see these profits, who don't get them, why does our heart beat for the profits they get? So they get less profits. Guess what? It still rains. The sun will come out. They'll just have less profits. And that will have consequences. But the world isn't going to come to an end. But we don't have to go there. Here's another way to solve it. It's very clear to me, having been in this section, that if you didn't have these lovely seats at all, you could make many more seats if they were as narrowly done as the steerage. In which case, if you got rid of it, you could handle more people, and the airlines wouldn't have to give up a nickel of profit. And you wouldn't have the division. You wouldn't, would you? Between first and second class, would you? And to give you an example of a society that did that, let me close with this story. Years ago, when I first started going to France, because my family, part of my family is French, I would arrive in Paris, a beautiful, beautiful city, and one of the most charming things for an American in Paris is the subway system. because, I know this is going to be hard to believe, it's clean. And it's quiet. It's quiet because the tires are rubber. The train comes through the tunnel and it doesn't blow your head off with that horrible noise that sounds like people scratching blackboards, you know, only louder, because they have rubber tires. But that's not what I want to talk to you about. I noticed when I was there something I had never seen before. There were first-class cars on the subway and second class. They were all second class except the one in the middle of the train. The middle car was painted a different color and had written it boldly across, first class. If you went into the subway, you had to tell the ticket person whether you were going first class or second. The first class ticket cost more than the second class ticket. It's the same train, but what was it? The middle class, the middle car was sparsely attended because nobody wanted to pay the extra money. So you could guarantee yourself a seat, and it was more nicely appointed. It wasn't all that different, but a little bit nicer, and not crammed, especially at rush hour. This was much appreciated. So you had first and second class. In the 1960s, things blew up in France. Some of you know, 1968, big year in France. The students and the workers made an alliance. The students went out on the streets against the government, and they called on the workers to join them. And to the surprise of everyone, the workers did, 10 million of them. And they declared that they had lost confidence in their government. Their government was probably the most popular leader of the 20th century, Charles de Gaulle, who had to leave Paris and go to an American air base in Germany because his people had driven him out. And the mood was euphoric. A new society was going to be born. Didn't turn out that way, but for a while, it shook everything in society. And here's what it did. It led to the people of Paris saying, we don't want two classes of subway. We don't want comfortable seats for people with money and uncomfortable seats for people without. That's not democratic. That's not fair. That's over with. And for the last 40 years, there is no two-class system. All the cars on the French subways are the same. Same price, same ticket. We don't allow it. So we could do that on our airplanes too, but we don't. We have a market system. That's how we distribute everything. You all know this, don't you? Because you live in a city where the market is driving out everybody but rich people from this city. You know that. All of you are thinking, unless you're very lucky and have landed the dream rent-controlled apartment of the universe, you know that that's happening. You can see it all around you. So whoever lived in this city, whatever the diversity that made this city great, however you think about this city, it's being transformed by the basic idea that the distribution of apartments goes to the people with the money. Fifth Avenue is famous in Manhattan because if you walk at night up and down Fifth Avenue, it's dark. Nobody's lights are on. You know why? If you ask a realtor, why? Because those apartments are not owned by Americans. They're owned by wealthy people all over the world for whom hiding or parking, depending on your level of honesty, your wealth by buying an apartment in New York is a clever way to get it out of the clutches of your own government, which is a shaky business. You don't want all your eggs in that basket. So you buy an apartment on Fifth Avenue. Once or twice a year, your nephew passing through stays there for 3 days. But other than that, this is just... So who gets the apartment? The people with the money. They don't even live there. We have a shortage of living space, and we have, by the way, thousands, tens of thousands of very, very luxurious, in many cases, apartments that's the market. That's the genius efficiency of the market. to distribute the scarce, beautiful apartments to people who are never in them because they're living in even more luxurious residences somewhere else. To believe in the market as some paragon of virtue is crazy. The next time you hear a politician, we have to leave this to the market, you've got a person from whom you should never buy a used car. Because you're dealing with somebody who's either nuts or hustling you. Hustling you. I got a PhD in economics. Part of what I had to do is I had to read a literature that's 100 years old called The Literature of Market Failures. I didn't make that list up. That's what it's called. It's 800 professors, many of whom love capitalism, but who show all the ways in which markets get results nobody wants. We live in a society that doesn't want to remember all of that literature. That was, by the way, written by people who got Nobel Prizes and who have chairs at the University of Chicago and places like that you wouldn't imagine. I had to read all of that to get my degree. Just like people know that the Earth is probably more than 6,000 years old. Probably. And that if you encounter a person who tells you it wasn't, and who goes on to tell you about Jonah's experience inside the whale, you know you're dealing with somebody whose way of handling the universe is different, I hope, from yours. When you hear someone talking about the marvels of the market, that's the same fundamentalism. It's just not in religion, it's in economics. And you ought to be at least as skeptical. Next item. The two parties. The economics of the two political parties. This is extremely important for obvious reasons, since our government is controlled by those two parties. I understand we have one senator from Vermont who is not a Republican or a Democrat. Do we have anybody else in the Senate who isn't? No, just that one. And even though he isn't, he looks like a Democrat to most everybody else. I don't mean this as a criticism. Yes, I do. I support Bernie Sanders. How could I not? But nonetheless, the two parties pretty much have a stranglehold on our political system. So it's important for us to understand the economics of these parties. So let's take a look. I'm going to start with the Republicans, and I'll do the Democrats. The Republican Party immediately has an immense problem, because the center of the Republican Party, its organizational and its financial core, is wealthy people and big companies. I mean, they say that too. There's no secret here. And the problem, right away, is that that's a small number of people in this country. That's not very many. I don't know, maybe 1 million or 2 million, whatever it is, it's small. We have a population of 330 million, and whatever that number is very small. So they're not going to be able to control politics or to be a political force if only what they rely on is themselves, that there's not enough of them, not even close. So in order for the Republican Party to function, to be a political force, to do what it does in this culture, it has to find a way to get other people aligned with it. Right? There's a famous Italian Marxist, Antonio Gramsci, who had a whole theory about how the people in charge have to take over, control things, in his language, achieve hegemony, the control of the whole society, by building a hegemonic bloc, he called it. And he was analyzing Italian society, but he understood it as applied everywhere. So the rich in the United States, corporations and wealthy people, who are the core of the Republican Party, who finance and make it possible, they have to build a bloc. They have to get large groups of people to see themselves as aligned with them. So let's take a look at who they do this with and how that works out. First, They build, and they've been building and been very successful for at least half a century, in building an alliance with the military. That's very, very important. We have 2 or 3 million people who directly or indirectly relate to the military, sometimes more in periods of warfare. That's a lot of votes, millions of voters. Can they work out a deal? And they can. They can. And here's what they do. We as a party, they say, we Republicans, we will be generous to a fault. We'll fund anything. You have a new aircraft carrier, we'll take 6. You know, you put us in political office and we will make the military happy. You want a new airline faster than the air fighter? We'll get you one. You want to have bases all over? We'll get you those. We'll do it. We ask only 2 things in return. One, you vote for us. The majority of the military vote Republican and have for decades. But the second thing is, we would like you to take the money we so generously give it to you and pay us way higher prices for what we sell to you than you could ever have to pay if you bought it anywhere else. That's an unending scandal in the United States. Periodically, there are news stories that indicate that a toilet seat that you could buy at Home Depot for $19 is purchased by the Pentagon, the exact same toilet seat, for $412. Why? Because that's the deal. We will fund you, and you overpay us. And we'll take the overpayment you give us and fund you with it. You understand? Scratching my back. This is the game. So that's worked real well. That was so powerful already shortly after World War II. It was in World War II that this was worked out. But so successful was it that Dwight Eisenhower, the leading general of the American Army, who becomes a president, on his way out of his presidency, makes that famous remark about the military-industrial complex. He said, we should be beware of it, because he could see this was and he was the head of the Republican Party. He was a Republican president. He knew exactly what had happened and talked about it, because on his way out, he could have that moment of honesty, something which has not troubled presidents since that time. Second group. Find people in the population whose weirdness you can celebrate. There are large numbers of Americans for whom it is extremely important that as they drive into town in their pickup truck, on a little rack in the back window behind them, there are guns. Lots of them. Maybe automatic guns where you hold the trigger down and it just spews out. It's really exciting. And the Republicans say, this is wonderful. This is wonderful. You should have these guns. You should have all kinds of guns. You should have them, and you should have them on your body when you go to the store. Better, when you go to school. Better, when you go to a bar, have them. Because then the large hordes seeking to separate you from your money will think twice. Because you may shoot them. You may shoot 6 other people in the bar, but you get the bad guy, hopefully. And the other is, you know, collateral damage. He was probably just hiding behind the other drinkers. Okay? So the Republicans celebrate the gun carriers. Keep it in your mind. Here's another one. The Republicans announce that they love churches. Oh boy, do they love churches. There isn't a church you can find that the Republicans don't love. Because Americans have ambivalent feelings about churches, this is an important constituency for the Republicans to cultivate. They've been doing a very good job, and they celebrate themselves as that. Here's another group. For lack of a better term, libertarians. People who have decided that the real evil in our society is the government. Oh boy, do they hate the government. If we could just get the government out, wow, would we be happy. The government is terrible. they're not so good on explaining why the government is so terrible, and so they tend to rely on the notion that this is not something that you have to explain. It's like self-evident. Government is terrible. Why? Because that's what governments are. And why are you so stupid as to keep asking me this question? It's obvious. So the Republicans have built powerful alliances with religious folks of all kinds, with gun advocates, with the military. I could go on.
Well, don't forget white racists.
Yeah, I could go on, and one of those we could talk about would be racists of all kinds. Another group we could talk about are people for whom immigration is the great evil in the world. There's lots of them. The point is not to make an exhaustive list because I don't have the time. The point is for you to see that they have to build these alliances. Why? Because they got a lot of problems, the Republicans, this group of big businesses and rich. Let's just go through them quickly. One, little businesses, of which there are many more than big ones. Big ones are the big, powerful, but for every big one, there's 5,000 little ones. And the little ones are constantly discovering that the big ones are their enemy. The big ones control the prices that the little ones have to pay if they're going to survive. The big ones can decide at a certain moment to go into a business, wiping out the little ones who try to survive. So there's lots of tension. How are they going to... Oh, so the Republicans realize we need all these little businesses. We've got to... Oh, I know. We will denounce governments for making life hard for little businesses. And we'll denounce unions because they threaten little bit, and that'll show the little businesses that we're their buddy, even though they know we're often their enemy. This is a tension. This is a tension. And the religious people are a little tense too, because the religious people listen to those leaders talk about the importance of religion, and then look at how they live and realize they are not practicing what they preach. In fact, they're doing everything that is denounced in the church and more than everybody else. And they seem to be playing us religious folk for fools. Ooh, that can hurt. That's a constant tension. Constant tension. And then there are the gun-toters and the racists who also kind of know somewhere and suspect that the reason the government is such a hateful thing for them is because they don't control the government, which leads to the thought, who does? And that can take you right back to the big businesses and the rich, which means the very people the big businesses and the rich have to hold in are always edgy and not so sure. So it's a very difficult thing for the Republicans to hold on to the mass of people, to keep these alliances with subsections of them from dissolving on them, blowing up on them. Now quickly, the Democrats. The core of the Democratic Party, it's the same thing. It's big business and wealthy people. Different groups of them, but basically big business. And if you're ever in doubt, go look at any of the internet sources of the funding of the two big parties, and you'll see very quickly how dependent they are, both of them, on a very relatively small part of our population that funds them and provides them with all of their basic means of functioning. The Democrats, therefore, have the same problem. How do you get a mass? The Democrats, however, go to a different group of folks. First of all, the Democrats work very hard to convince poor people, at least the poor people that vote, that they're somehow their friend. We are the friend of the poor people. We are the friend of union members. We're the friend of the unions. We're the friend of minorities. We're the friend of ethnic minorities, racial minorities, whatever. We're the friend of women. Particularly the Democrats are focusing on single women, most women being single these days. That's a big, and they did very well. No way that Obama would have won without the vote of single women. Were wildly lopsided in his favor. Women, particularly younger women, single women. Academics, big support among school teachers at all levels, who of course, to the everlasting hatred of the Republicans, let that leak in the classroom, making young people tilt in ways that they do not like. Gay people, ecologically interested folks, the Democrats go after all of them. But they also have terrible troubles, because the very people they claim to be for look at them and say, what are you doing for me? If you're a union member, for example, when Obama ran and I don't want to pick on Obama because he's really no different from all the other presidents, but that's the point. He isn't any different. So when Obama came in, the union said, we want one thing from you. We want the dues checkoff business to be adjusted so that it's a little easier for us to gather the signatures of a majority of workers at a place we want to organize, and if they sign these cards, well, then we can get an election to see if you know how unions work. That was a card check, it was called. That's what they wanted. And Obama promised it to them when he was running for office in 2008. He gets into office in 2008. He gets reelected in 2012. It's as if it never happened. He didn't get that. The bill was never put through. It's gone. So the unions keep supporting the Democrats because they're convinced that the Republicans would be worse for them, probably true, but they don't get anything. And that leads to a lot of bitterness, resentment, and that sits there. And that makes that alliance weaker and weaker. Poor people. It's not good to be poor, in case you hadn't noticed. Mel Brooks used to make that a theme in his films. We kind of know that. And the Democrats promise all kinds of things to poor people, but the delivery is, let's call it, spotty. And that makes poor people think that voting is a waste of their time. Minorities, the same thing. Immigrants, the same thing. Academics. The Democrats sometimes have an easier time because they can always point to the Republicans, and that so terrifies large numbers of people they need an alliance with that they can hold them. But it's not because people are enthusiastic about the Democrats. It's this endless lesser of two evil game that they play, and that's not a very secure way. So why do I tell you all of this? Because beneath the veneer of the two big powerful parties is a very fragile, very insecure, very wobbly structure. They're not the big powerhouses they would like to have us all believe. They're very shaky. And here's where the shakiness could really get interesting. Suppose the mass of people that the Republicans have drawn in to a shaky alliance, and the mass of the Democrats that those leaders have drawn in, suppose they all, more or less at the same time, began to say, wait a minute, there's another option. We don't have to be patsies for the Republicans or for the Democrats. Suppose we all got together and supported another party. Not only would that party be very powerful, but the Republicans and the Democrats would be no match for it at all. They'd be reduced to what they are, the rich and the corporate leaders. Don't think that that's some kind of pie in the sky. Don't think that that's impossible. Why not? To end for today, I'm going to give you an example of a country in the last few years where exactly that has happened. Greece. Greece was a country like the United States with two parties, the equivalent, in effect, of the Republicans and the Democrats. The Republican equivalent is called, it's still there, the New Democracy Party. And the Democrats, it's confusing, I know, was called the PASOK, the Socialist Party of Greece. Socialism was a name that it's spelled differently from Democratic Party, but that's about the difference. Okay, so you had the Republican equivalent and the Democrat. Together they got the overwhelming majority of votes. They would play like we do in this country. You know, a few years you're the government, and a few years you're the, you know, Papandreou family has it for this period of time, the other Greek families have it the other time. And then the crisis hit, 2008. And over the next period, from 2008 to 2012, it's not very long, 3-4 years, the mass of the Greek people looked at these two parties and said, in the way only Greeks can, we're done with you. You are not getting our votes. It's over. And a little leftist party that most people have never heard of, probably most Greeks too, but certainly outside of Greek, nobody ever heard of it, Syriza party, or however you pronounce it, goes from 3% of the vote to now being probably the #1 party in Greece, getting about 30% in the polls, which is more than the two older parties get together. Wow. The abandonment of the Republicans and Democrats as a mass of people see that they were had for a long time and they don't want to be had anymore. No one knows where this is going to go. There will have to be a vote in the next year or two in Greece, if not sooner. And if the Syriza wins, the peculiarities of corrupt politics in Greece being what it is, they have on the books, for those of you who don't know, that the party that comes in first does not only get the number of seats equivalent to the vote it got, but it gets an extra 50 seats for being #1. What that means is it's the dominant party, even though it doesn't have anything like that kind of dominance in the... That was a way to keep these two parties in power. Now they're horrified. If Syriza comes in first, they get the 50 extra seats, which means Syriza would be in an it would be the first time a government that has as its among its slogans, Greece can do better than capitalism. Uh-oh! Uh-oh! Now that's because the two parties could not maintain their tenuous, fragile alliances. And to think that that's an impossible analogy to what could happen in this country makes no sense. Because the fragility of our alliances is clear. The leaders of the two parties know that if you can move just 5 or 10% of the people hooked in by the Republicans and get them to shift over to the Democrats, you win, and vice versa. They're actually both playing the game that I'm trying to get you to see of the fragility of what holds them together. And the point we need to understand is that if we were able to disconnect significant numbers of both of them into another way of seeing things, then the politics of this country would change faster than anyone has foreseen and would make all of our heads spin. We've run out of time. Thank you very, very much.